Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Very special episode of the show for you today. Not only do we have beard supremacy, not only do we have an ecumenical encounter between someone who attends a fraternity and someone who attends a society, we also have beard supremacy here on the show today. So I'm very happy to have my fellow Canadian traditional Catholic, Brian Holdsworth. Brian, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Kennedy.
Excellent. And this is also, we should say, we're across time zones. I'm in southwestern Ontario. You're out in Alberta, which means for people that don't know Canada, that's like 4 Europes away as far as distance goes. It's so big in this country. So there's a lot going on here, which is fascinating. All right. So for those who don't know Brian's channel, you can check it out, Brian Holdsworth. That's the actual name of the channel, Brian Holdsworth?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just something that I had started as sort of a hobby channel, so I didn't think much about branding or anything at the time. It was just my username, and then it took on a life of its own, and so now it's still just the same thing, same name.
I'm thinking of rebranding. Let me see if you like the name. So you ever read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis?
Yep.
I think everybody has. But so I want to do something called like Mere Tradition. Just
Okay.
Like, what is tradition? We hear this word tradition all the time. It's more than just Latin Mass. It's music. It's literature. It's architecture. So I just kind of that's a direction I'm thinking of going. So I might rebrand as Mere Tradition, but I think if I take away the Kennedy Report name, people will get lost. Maybe.
I mean, that's always the risk with branding, is that it's meant to identify and it's meant to associate with certain things, right? So if you change the name, you always risk diluting that. But if it makes an improvement, then sometimes it's worth the cost in that.
Because your background's in marketing, right?
Yeah, and branding specifically. Marketing is a huge umbrella, but branding is kind of the key thing that everything that I do orbits around.
Okay, so do you think, from your professional opinion, if I said like Mere Tradition with Kennedy Hall, would that be an improvement to the Kennedy Report?
It has the potential to. So typically, whenever I'm evaluating something that is branding related, so whether it's a name or a logo or anything like that, there's generally 4 criteria that I turn to. The first is simplicity. This is obvious enough. And the more simple it is the more simple it is, the easier it is to understand, and the easier it is to remember and associate with something. The next is that it should be representative. So it should mean something. It should be something that you can associate with something else, right? But there are good versions and there are bad versions of this. The bad version of this is every dentist in the world, their logo is a pulled tooth, which is just like, that's not what people want to think of when they go to the dentist. An interesting version of this is something like Starbucks. So Starbucks, their logo is a mermaid, right? Now, what does that have to do with coffee? Nobody knows, but it inspires some curiosity in people's minds. They think, well, there must be a story. Why is there a mermaid, right? Maybe like the first people who got out to the West Coast had some sort of an encounter with a mermaid, and this legacy has built up this great chain of coffee stores. Who knows what it is, but it creates an association, it creates a mythology and a story behind it. So it should mean something. It should represent something. Okay. Sometimes, again, it could just be really explicit, right? If you're a plumber, maybe it's a leaky pipe or something like that. Or if you're a dentist, it's a pulled tooth. Other times, it could be something more elaborate. The next is that it should be unique. You want to differentiate yourself from others who are out there. For the most part, sometimes you want to associate yourself with others if you want to kind of ride their coattails a little bit. But for the most part, you want to control your brand. You want to be deliberate about your brand. So you don't want people to accidentally form an impression of you. And that's what a brand is. It's just an impression that people have of you or your organization. And if you're easily confused with somebody else, then you're letting them dictate the impression that people have of you, right? So you want it to be unique and easily recognizable. And then the last one is it should be attractive. It should be something that resonates with your target audience. And that goes without saying. So perhaps the weakness in the Kennedy Report would be something like, well, it sounds like a news show. It sounds like, here's the latest news. Here's the report from the Kennedy desk or something like that, right? And if that's what you're doing, then that makes sense. But if that isn't most of what you're doing, then maybe that can be misleading or confusing for people. So to do something that's more broad cultural commentary, if that's your goal, then I think that makes sense to try and explore a potential brand that would indicate that in a better way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, the reason I invited John actually is I wanted to get this consultation for free. So thank you very much for that. But
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But when I started out, I was a teacher. That's a whole other conversation. I was a Catholic school teacher, and I basically had to leave just because I'm not a communist, and the system is just really bad, sadly, here in Ontario. And so I fell into like having to make a living, and then the Fatima Center asked me if I wanted to do shows. I was writing for them, and they were like, "It's the Kennedy Report." So it's just kind of the name that stuck with me because at that time, it was during all the lockdown stuff. It was impossible not to talk about some of the news. But since then, I've kind of adapted and don't really. I do talk about some of the church issues sometimes, but it's probably like 2 out of 10 shows right now or something. Like it's not really the predominant thing. Anyway, that makes sense. Yeah, that's interesting that you say that.
An interesting use case as well for most Catholic audience members would be Matt Fradd's show, Pints with Aquinas. He started that as like a school project almost, I think, as a podcast that was about exploring Thomas's thought. I think just kind of going through the Summa in particular articles and questions. And then he eventually expanded out to doing a YouTube channel and doing interviews and things like that. And because it wasn't just about, okay, let's sit down with the angelic doctor and probe his mind and have a pint with him. That was sort of the concept of the podcast. He started wondering, well, maybe I need to change the show to something like, or the name to something like the Matt Fradd Show. And he kind of toyed with that at the beginning. And I even designed a logo for the Matt Fradd Show with him at the time. And then he second guessed that and realized, you know what, people know it as Pints with Aquinas, and I'm just going to keep going with that. And so he reverted back to that, and it's been working well for him.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny you mentioned Starbucks, though. I used to work for Starbucks. I worked there for 4 years when I was between the age of like 17 and 21. So I'm 35 now, so it was, whatever. Actually, it was about 17, almost, oh goodness, I'm getting old. About 17 years ago that I actually started there. And they told us when we would get hired, there was this whole initiation thing. And the Starbucks, I think it's from Moby Dick. I don't remember. But it's like it was on the hull of the ship or something like that. And it's a siren, and that was the thing. And that was sort of the background for it.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. But still, what's the association between Moby Dick and coffee?
Nothing.
Yeah. But there must be something, though,
Seattle.
right? Like either one of the founders like really loves Moby Dick, maybe, or who knows. But it just makes us think there's something more to this than merely I want to sell you a product, right? Like, and that's what most brands are aiming to do, is to try to bring you into something more cultural, something more profound than merely consumerism.
You know whose brand I really like is Dr. Kwasniewski's. Tradition and Sanity.
Okay.
I actually pay to subscribe to his Substack because I love it so much. But it's true. It's just Tradition and Sanity, and it's like you kind of know exactly what you're getting, and it's kind of catchy. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and it plays off of something that's familiar to people like Theology and is that what the book was? Theology and Sanity by Frank Sheed?
I think so.
Yeah,
that's true. Okay, so I thought today, besides getting marketing advice, which was very helpful, especially for all the small business owners in the audience, we would talk about just things that are not, how should I put this? Everyone's basically sick of all the news, whether it's Israel-Palestine or whether it's the synod or the Speaker of the House thing or whatever the thing is, Trudeau every 5 minutes or something silly come out of Ottawa for us, whatever it is. And, it'd be nice for people to have an edifying conversation about Catholicism and the things that we love. And Brian and I do share a lot in common. We've talked on email and stuff about our love of, things like Chesterton and just basically traditional things and music. And I know you just had Dr. K on about his music book, and I narrated the audiobook for that, and I loved the book. And
right on.
And I love that era. We call it classical, but really classical is one period. But for the sake of conversation, I love classical music as a genre and fiddle music, and we actually just kind of listen to that as a family all the time. And so I thought we'd just talk about what drew us to the Catholic faith, and maybe that will flower into tangents that people will enjoy about, other things. So You were, I remember watching a video years ago about how you became Catholic. You are a convert, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, and you were raised as a practicing Protestant or just sort of nominally so?
So I was baptized in the United Church, which, for those who aren't Canadian, it was sort of like a merging of the older mainline churches here in Canada, and became something of a Protestant rival to the Catholic Church, at least in terms of size. It was the biggest Protestant denomination, but like most mainline Protestant denominations, it had liberalized quite a bit by the time I appeared in temporal history, and my parents weren't particularly attached to it, although it was just part of their family heritage were United Protestants, right? Um, so so that's what I was baptized into. My dad didn't have a faith really; he was kind of a lifelong atheist, especially at that point. And my mom, I think she associated church going with what it means just to be a well-to-do citizen, an upstanding citizen of the world, if not Canadian society. And so for her, this meant integrating in some sort of a church life. And I don't know what her prayer life or what her concept of the Trinity or any of these sort of traditional Christian doctrines would have been. But it didn't really last very long. I remember going to Sunday school when I was really little, but by the time I was probably 5 or 6, I think our church going days had ended. And by the time I was 9, my parents had split up, and that really solidified an aversion towards church. In the case of my dad, he was able to just embrace his atheism. In the case of my mom, I think that she felt a lot of animosity in light of the fact that she was now divorced, within her sense of what church acceptance might look like. And so she moved away into other forms of like new age spirituality and stuff. And for the most part, we were able to just find our way based on conventional secular agnostic pagan wisdom, and that's basically what we did. So our values were just sort of whatever happened to appeal to my mom. She had primary custody over us, so we spent most of our time with her, but she was working. And so a lot of our sense of what is good and true and beautiful just came from the popular culture, from watching TV, from video games, from movies, and from school, which doesn't tend to offer much else than just the sort of the popular sentiment. So yeah, I would say a pretty typical millennial upbringing through the 90s, until I started to reevaluate this question. Now, because I was baptized, I mean, I can only speculate about this, but there had always been a strand of, let's say, curiosity, or maybe even a spark of faith in my life. I had always wondered about God. There were times in my life where I had sort of prayed God. God was pretty nebulous, though, in my mind. It certainly wasn't anything like a Trinitarian concept of divinity. And then Jesus was something in the backdrop there, sort of like, I'm familiar with this guy and I'm familiar with the Bible. I don't know how he fits in, but I don't think I would have ever found myself praying to Jesus growing up at all. It was just sort of the monolith of God, who is very much sort of this personified father figure in my mind, but still also very abstract. And I remember also having a kind of deal with God in my mind that I don't think I would ever really sit down and pray this or verbalize this at all. But I had this notion in my mind that one day I'm going to become a good person. But while I'm young and having fun, that can wait. I think a lot of people, maybe they don't associate this with God, but they have this idea like, well, one day I'm going to become an adult and become responsible. But for now, I'm just going to have fun, right? So for me, it was the same kind of thing, but there was somehow that was tied to some understanding of God, at least as a kid. And so when I actually eventually did start to find myself confronted with moral failures and a sort of a crisis of understanding of my identity and where my direction in life, I think I probably did associate that back with, okay, so part of what this sorting myself out means also confronting this question of God. Who does God exist? Who is he in relation to me? And what is he asking from me? And as I did so, I mean, there's a whole lot of context around what inspired me to do this, but as I did so, I came to believe that there actually was a God, and that he was calling me to do more with my life.
Whoops, there you go. It was muted. Very similar on my end. Parents split when I was 5 or 6. I can't remember. Like, I was that young. I don't know if it was, I think it was grade 1. but I don't know if it was first semester or second. Anyway, it was long ago. Um, on the one hand, I was so young that I don't remember much before that, so there wasn't like I should say this, there wasn't like an explicit trauma feeling, if that makes sense, because it wasn't like I have memories of something rupturing, although I'm sure if I sat down with a shrink, he'd unpack a bunch of nonsense. Um, but that my parents were Catholic. They are Catholic, but lapsed, remarried, that sort of thing. So there was nothing. I was baptized, went to Catholic school, but the Catholic schools in Ontario. Well, it's funny. I actually did have a little bit of faith when I was about 7 or 8 because at my local public school, this is how much things have changed. What year were you born? I was born in 88.
82.
Okay. So, I'm going to elementary school in, 1992, 93, 94, kind of those 95, grade 1, 2, 3. And at that time, like in Ontario, they were still saying the Lord's Prayer with the announcements until I think I was in junior kindergarten or kindergarten. And there was still Bible study, so it was not taboo. So it was after school, but like a lot of kids would go. And that's funny. The ladies from the local United Church would come to a Bible study, and I remember going to that because again, even though the parents didn't have the faith, they were like, "Well, go to the Bible study. That's what good kids do. They go to Bible studies." And so I went, and they had the little magnets they'd put on the whiteboard of all the characters of the Bible, and I remember thinking Jesus was good and all this kind of stuff, and then went to Catholic school, learned a little bit, but not much. It was really bad, sadly. And then I had a Protestant youth group when I was, because I had no idea the difference, Protestant, Catholic, what did I know? Protestant youth group, I was grade 6 or 7. It was a very charismatic environment. And it was all praise and worship and the hands in the air and whatever. And I had a come to Jesus moment when I was like 12.
Wow.
It didn't last. It was like, it lasted sentimentally insofar as throughout high school, I was like, it's good to be a Christian and I'm proud of my Catholic heritage. I was not like a secularist. But then throughout university, the problem is that I was, how should I put this? Like without sounding self-aggrandizing. Like I like to read, I like to write, I like to debate, of course, that's why I'm in this line of work. So, I asked all these questions. I realized basically that my teachers had no idea what they were talking about. And I realized that, in my opinion, I thought I knew everything, because I had got a degree. So, of course, I knew everything. And so I just sort of left it. And then in my mid-20s, had a big coming back. But yeah, similar background as far as the broken home thing. And, yeah, anyway. So you're about roughly how old when you start to be like, I want to pursue like faith as an objective thing?
Well, I would say I was about 19 when I started 18 or 19 when I started accidentally exploring that. And that was through just the circumstances of my life were unraveling a little bit. So I'm the kind of person who, well, I'll say from my work ethic growing up was one in which I found that I was able to achieve the level of success that I could be satisfied with with very little effort, right? So I had a certain measure of talent that would get me the grades I wanted or get me the friends I wanted or get, if I was playing sports, same kind of thing. I didn't want to put in a lot of extra effort though to build upon that and to achieve some sort of excellence or anything. And that had worked well enough for me until I had applied to the program that I wanted to get into in college, which was like a visual communications program. So it was kind of a fine arts program, but I wanted to be a graphic designer and a web designer, and this was really all that existed at the time. And so you had to submit a portfolio and do an interview, and I think write a few essays as well. And I had really done the bare minimum on this, thinking that, this has always worked for me in the past, until I didn't get in. And so a lot of my friends were going off to college, except for me. I was still working at the paint store that I worked at through high school, the kind in which, as the part-time high school kids, we would look down upon the full-timers for this is all you could do with your life. And now all of a sudden here I am, not even doing as much as they have done with their lives, right? And just thinking like, boy, this is a real wake up call. What am I doing with my life? I need to get my act together, because I had expected much more from myself, but not because I deserved it. Obviously, I had a bad attitude, and didn't know anything about virtue or vice, or the kinds of things that I was operating within. Um, so that required a bit of soul searching. Maybe this was the moment where I had to become that good person that I had always said I might become at some point. Simultaneously, my girlfriend at the time, she was the kind of person who every 6 months or so would get a new best friend. Um, and for her, she didn't really understand friendship very well. And this is only something that I'm starting to piece together better myself. But I recently read The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis, and one of the things he says about friendship is that friendship is the kind of relationship that is built upon mutual love of something. Like there's a common denominator, something that you love together. And so the orientation of a friendship is two or more people looking towards something that they love and aiming their lives towards that thing, and sharing the love and the relationship that they have with each other out of this mutual love. So, for example, religion could be this thing, right? We're all Catholic. We all go to the same church. We all believe the same thing. We're looking towards God together. That's what friendship is. But my girlfriend, for her, she friendship was for her more like eros. So eros is where you, the thing that you love is the other person, not some common interest, right? So if friendship is people all looking in a common direction, eros is people looking in the opposite direction, people looking at each other and just infatuated with each other. And that's how she treated friendship. So she was always some new infatuation that she had, whether it was someone of the opposite or the same sex. And in this case, it was a friend. It was a mutual friend that I'd gone to high school with for a long time, and I didn't know much about her. Her name was, well, I'm not going to say her name just to spare her in case she doesn't want it out there. Let's say her name was Sharon. So our mutual friend Sharon was somebody that I had known in high school and gone snowboarding with a bunch. That's how I knew her mostly. But as it turns out, Sharon's family had a Bible study that her mom would lead, and I didn't know anything about this aspect of her life. And so my girlfriend said, "Hey, I'm going to this Bible study, and I want you to come." And I was like, "No, thank you. I'm not interested in that at all." But she really wore the pants in that relationship, so she made me go, and so I reluctantly went. And as I did so, I found myself really um, enjoying the conversation. This wasn't really a scriptural study per se. It was more, let's just talk about life. Let's talk about some of the things that maybe you haven't been in the habit of talking about with your parents that you should have been, right? These are the kinds of conversations every parent should be having with their kids routinely as they're growing up. And a lot of us didn't get that. And so to have these conversations with her mom, who was a very holy and serene and humble woman, uh, was very meaningful and enjoyable. And she would also lead us through these sort of prayerful exercises. But it was all very high level. You didn't even get a sense that this is explicitly Christian necessarily. And my relationship with my girlfriend ended. And she stopped going to the Bible study. She found some new infatuation, but I kept going because there was something there that I was really drawn to. And so the more we would have these conversations, the more I thought, I really do need to confront this question of God. And this family just inspired me so much too. Like they had so much of what I wanted in my own family. And they had so many characteristics and qualities and virtues. I wouldn't have recognized them as virtues, but they had something about them, some indefinable quality in my mind that I wanted. And so I thought, well, maybe it's their faith. And so one night after I came home from the Bible study, I was the only person who was home. Like it was dark. I don't know where the rest of my family was, but this was pretty typical in my family life that, we were all just doing our own thing. And I thought, okay, well, here's a moment I have to myself. And so I just sat down on the couch. I didn't turn any lights on or anything. And I just put my distress signal out into the universe and said, God, if you're there, can you reveal yourself to me in some way that will be meaningful for me? And if you do, I will take that to mean that you want me to follow you, however I understand that. And it's really hard to explain what happened next. But there was definitely a physical presence. Like I felt a physical presence. I felt overwhelmed by just this sense of peace and serenity and goodness. And it was extremely I don't know. It just, I'd never experienced anything like that, and it touched me just to the sort of the core of my soul, and it was convincing for me. It's probably the most mystical experience I've ever had, and I resolved from that day forward. Okay, well then you do exist, and I'm going to pursue you and try to know you better in my life. So that was really the start of what inspired me to take theism at least more seriously. And since it had come in a somewhat Christian context, and because I had some familiarity with Christianity, I thought, well, that's the place to start. So I'm going to start reading the Bible, and simultaneously, I think I need to probably find a church to go to. This family, Sharon and her family, they were Catholic, and so I was, but I there was a lot of anti-Catholicism in my family's heritage. My grandparents were extremely anti-Catholic. In the city that I grew up in, the public schools were actually Catholic schools because it's an old Francophone missionary or mission where this community is founded. But their Catholic identity was very diluted in the public schools here. Um, and so my impression of Catholicism was extremely negative, other than this particular family. And so I thought, well, I'm going to find my own way. And so I started reading scripture, and I went back to the United Church where I was baptized, was quickly turned off from what was going on there. My aim was, I want to know how to be a Christian, because I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what that means. And I'm also reading scripture, and I don't understand what a lot of what is contained there. Specifically, I was reading the New Testament. So really familiarizing myself with Jesus' life and teachings. And so I kind of took a step back from church, and then I would go try another one, and I'd be like, okay, that's interesting, not what I expected. And then I'd go try another one. And the thing that I found very frustrating about the whole experience was that there was just incompatibilities. You'd get little glimpses of things that I was reading about in scripture and expecting to see in a church, and that was good. But then a lot of other things that I was like, well, why are we doing this? This doesn't seem to make any sense at all. And then in other churches, some different fragment that was good and perhaps consistent with what I was reading in scripture, but then of course other things, and a lot of incompatibility. And I just thought, I'm reading about this group of 12 that Jesus is forming, these people who he's really diligently hammering into these guys what he wants from them, and then he's giving them the ability to do the things that he was doing, to heal the sick, to cast out demons, and to proclaim the kingdom. Pretty much his authority, as far as I could tell. And then, of course, you come across things like Matthew 16, where he explicitly gives them this binding, indisputable authority. And I'm sitting here looking at the landscape of churches that I'd gone to, and I'm thinking, like, nobody even pretends like they have this authority or any of the abilities to lead like he does. And the more I became acquainted with some of their theology and their ecclesiology, I was coming to realize that they actually explicitly deny that such an authority exists. And so I was like, well, who even claims to have that authority, let alone actually has it? And as far as I could tell, at least in the Western tradition, Catholicism was the only one. So for me, this became an exploration of, okay, Protestantism versus Catholicism. And again, from everything I had been reading in scripture, sure, there were little things that Protestants could nitpick about, like call no man father. But it's like, yeah, but the Catholics have an explanation for that. And, it's not a slam dunk case, right? That's not a silver bullet against Catholicism. Meanwhile, there's bigger picture things like apostolic authority and apostolic succession that the Protestants don't even pretend to have. So as I explored that, and as I read about the history, I just found myself siding with Catholicism. And I really didn't want Catholicism to be true, because the Catholic parish that I had snuck into for the odd time and went to check out, I was like, I don't think I identify with these people at all. It was a much older demographic. The music and the preaching were very, very subpar to what I had experienced in different Protestant churches. I was more in the habit of going to a young adult Pentecostal church at that time. And 1,000 young adults, people my own age who looked like me, who talked like me, were coming to this thing every week, every Sunday. The preaching was amazing. The music was praise and worship, which I was sort of like, that's not my style, but they're doing a good job. Like, it's quality. Whereas at the Catholic Church, it's definitely not my style, and they're not doing a good job of it. So my attraction to Catholicism was non-existent. But I couldn't deny the truth of the things that I was reading. And so I entered into RCIA, and And at least insofar as my conversion to Catholicism goes, that's the rest is history.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, yeah, I was speaking of that family that you encountered, just sort of the goodness of family life, and you think what's behind it. That was important for me as well. That come to Jesus moment I mentioned, where I was at this youth group, was actually with a friend of mine whose dad was a teacher at the old public school I went to. And they were just like non-denominational, kind of like Baptist in their background, but non-denominational. And their family was great. Like, they had a bunch of kids, and they were just wonderful. I mean, the parents loved each other. They loved the kids. The mom stayed home. She made egg salad from scratch at lunchtime. It was like, whoa, what is this little perfect paradise, you know? And where, you know, my mom's working, and it's a tough grind. And so that was a big thing too. I was like, whatever these people have, I want that thing. So that seems to be it for a lot of people. Yeah.
I think so. Like, one thing I'll say too about the family life dimension. So I was a bit older. I was 9 when my parents first split, and 10 when they got divorced. And I'll say that was such a traumatic thing for me that I felt like I've experienced something so hard, and yet nobody who should care seems to care that this is happening all over the place. This very traumatic and awful thing. And if anything, it felt like I was getting gaslit by society, where they're just sort of like, yeah, people should be able to get divorced if they fall out of love, and it's no big deal. And it's like, no, it was a big deal. And not just for me, but my brothers. And the trauma wasn't just something that was internal. It was manifesting itself in very awful ways in our lives as we tried to move forward.
I became a really angry kid. Did you get the anger problem?
Oh yeah. With that. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So I became a very rebellious person as a result of that too, right? Because the thing that I thought, the good thing that I thought that I should have, the people that I thought I could depend upon and trust had betrayed that and confiscated that from me. And so when it comes to your elders imposing rules and trying to form you and mentor you, I just thought, I'm not going to listen to you at all. I don't trust what you have to say. And so I became deeply embedded within like skateboarding culture and punk rock music and heavy metal and all this kind of stuff, and really identified with at least the emotion behind all of that, right? Like, just screw the world. It's betrayed me, so exactly. I'm not going to be loyal to it, you know? And the other thing, you know, as I started to explore churches, it's like the Catholic Church seemed to be the only one who treated marriage with the severity that was consistent with the effects of it being ruptured in my life, right?
Right.
Like, this is an actually really important thing, and we want to honor it, and we want to protect it, and uncompromisingly. Whereas everybody else was just like, yeah, it's okay, no big deal. It's like, no, it's a big deal. It screwed me up.
Yeah. It's this idea of the trauma you go through. There's two things I want to touch on with that. The trauma that you went through, almost like the photo negative of a picture, like you saw it from the other side, and you go, if it hurts this much, it must be the reverse. It must be that important.
Absolutely.
And I agree. So, you know, I don't remember what age it was, but I remember from a young age, you know, I had a couple girlfriends before I got married, you know, but I got married relatively young. I was 24. I would have been married earlier. We got engaged when I was 22, but you know, the world tells us to wait, and you know, you buy a house for all the secular things, right? And whatever. We weren't practicing at the time, so we didn't do things the right way, and I wish we did, but such is life. And but nonetheless, I remember at a young age saying to myself, like almost like a promise, like I'm never going to get divorced. And I remember even when I was in sort of like the dating world, which I wasn't in very long, thankfully, I remember even when I was like 16, you know, talking about having girlfriends and stuff, and I said to myself, why would I ever want to be in a relationship with somebody that I didn't want to marry? And I would explain things like that to like guys I was on the football team with. I'm like the captain of the football team. We're all a bunch of jocks, and they're just talking locker room talk. And I'm like, I don't know, man. Like I might want to marry her one day. They're like, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, I don't know what is wrong with me.
Right.
But I just couldn't conceive it otherwise, because I was like, well, this thing will lead to this thing. And when that thing breaks, it really hurts people. And so that was something and that's one of the reasons why today in the church, like, I'm really sympathetic to a lot of people who take different views on certain things, because the trauma that's going on with a lot of Catholics today, it's just difficult. Like, it's just really hard. It's just really hard for people. You know, they're just trying to
Yeah.
whether it's the papacy stuff or their bishop or whatever the thing is. And people are kind of in like a fog of war. That's kind of what happens with trauma. So I'm pretty I'm pretty easy on people if they take different views on certain things when it comes to like what the response should be to the crisis. Because when you're in that position of trauma, it's like anybody's guess what you should do. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's hard to remember that because it feels like we're, like you say, we are at war a lot of the time. But this has certainly been, the more I reflect on it, the more I contemplate it. It's becoming more and more my official policy, whether I can actually live up to it or not, is to give people some room. It seems to me that there are characters out there who are pretty malicious, though, at the same time, and you know, there's only so much room I'm willing to give them. But you know, the differences that you and I have, for example, in our ecclesiology, like I sympathize with people that end up going to the SSPX. I mean, I have concerns, and I think that there are compromises there, but at the same time, I can understand why people feel that it's a necessary compromise.
Yeah, and yeah, that's people. Yeah, they're just trying to get their kids to heaven, and
yes,
there's not a lot of options in a lot of ways. So I want to touch on this idea of friendship because I think, like me, you'll probably have experienced when you became a Catholic, you probably had a really easy time making new friends that became good friends, and I experienced that. And I was talking with a family member the other day who is in sort of the secular world, and he was explaining to me how like nobody has friends in their 20s nowadays. Like nobody has good friends. I mean, okay, by chances, the odd person you grew up with, they still live in town or whatever. Okay, fine. Maybe there's like a kinship of proximity or something. But, you know, if it's not a work friend, if you're done playing college football and it's not somebody you're on the team with, people like don't have really deep, meaningful relationships with people who they're not in a romantic relationship with. And what you say about the four loves, Pope Benedict wrote a book, I read it years ago, on Christian friendship. I think it's either called On Christian Brotherhood or Christian Friendship. It's quite short. If you haven't read it, I'd recommend it. I think it's like 80 pages or something. I read it in like an afternoon. And he says, which it's a very traditionally minded statement that would be very difficult for a lot of people to hear, but he says Catholics can't even really have true friendships with Protestants. And he has all this theology, and he goes through St. Paul about it. Now, obviously, he's speaking in the general sense. People have different types of friendships. But he was talking about that true communion, so to speak, between one man and another. It can only flower to its fullest when the most fundamental things are shared to the degree that they have been exhausted logically. So, you know, yes, okay, a Protestant guy and a Catholic guy, okay, we're buddies. But like, again, as you say with marriage, ultimately, that friend of mine, unless he has some personal conviction about contraception, like, you know, there's going to be a point in his mid-30s when, you know, they're going to make a joke about snip, snip, I went down to the doctor. And it's like at that moment, our friendship's basically done because, like, that revolts me, you know? Like, I mean, sorry to sound so harsh to people, but, like, I find it vile. I find it an abomination, you know? And that's those are the sticking points. So maybe you can comment on that. But also, did you find when you became a Catholic that all of a sudden you started to make friendships with people in almost effortlessly, in a sense?
So no, I didn't. So two things happened. Well, one thing happened very sharply, which was that I. In the same way that if you were friends with somebody who did something that you disagreed with, it would be averse to you and it would be very hard to maintain a relationship with them. As I moved into Catholicism and this new way of life that I was trying to adopt, my old friends who I'd grown up with, and I had a lot of friends growing up and through high school and everything, they couldn't relate to where I was going, right? 18, 19-year-old guys, the thing that they want to do every weekend is go to the bar and get drunk, right? And so for the first little while, I was like, okay, I guess I'm just the designated driver. But that got old pretty fast. And I don't think they liked having me around as the sober guy all the time who was just sort of frowning in the corner and disapproving. So just practically speaking, our lives kind of went in separate directions, right? With the example that you give, it doesn't take much, because even within my Catholic community, there are some families who, let's say, are more open to life than others. There are some who are using NFP almost like it's contraception, right? And
Yes.
we have a big family, my wife and I. So we have 7 kids, 14 to 2, and so that means as we spend time with other friends, it's a family affair, right? Like, we don't really want our kids to have relationships with people we don't know. We don't want to be going and spending time with other people that they don't really know. So it's sort of like, well, we have to find friends whose lives really align with ours, who have kids that get along with our kids, and who are available, and who we get along with, and who, of course, we share the important things like our Catholic faith with. So it really doesn't take much for, just practically speaking, to end up going in separate directions in lifestyle, and the challenges that come with trying to maintain those relationships. But I really do take the point that Benedict was making there, because it is possible to have a friendship based on some mutual love. Like, let's say we both really like the Edmonton Oilers, the hockey team where I live, right? I can build a friendship with somebody. Not that I'm not a big hockey fan, but if I was a big hockey fan, I could see, yeah, my neighbor really likes hockey. We spend time together watching hockey, and that's great.
Yeah.
But in order for it to come to its full fruition, in order to really blend your lives together, it has to be built on something more than that. And ultimately, there's going to be a tension there. There's going to be, it's very hard to tolerate significant moral diversion among people who have relationships with each other. People will feel insecure. People will feel judged. People will judge, and that's just very difficult to maintain. That's happened certainly in my family relationship, as I don't come from a Catholic family, and so maintaining those relationships, it's not based on the bonds of friendship so much, and usually it's not with family. Usually it's based on affection, which is just sort of this kind of love that is comfortable and familiar and hard to abandon. But friendship is, again, built on quite a bit more. The ideal is when you have friendship and affection. I mean, that's just where it's easy and natural, and you're comfortable with each other, but then you also have something in common on top of that you can occupy your conversations and inspire your mutual love. So I didn't, when I first came into the Catholic Church, the particular parish where I started attending didn't have many young adults, so I had a tough time meeting other young Catholics. And my wife converted too, and so this was something that we prayed about a lot in the beginning of our marriage. Just for friends, we need community. We need people who will support us in this crazy life that we're trying to lead. And God did provide. We found ourselves in a position where we started hosting like a prayer group at our house, and people just started showing up. It was obvious that we were feeding a need that was prominent. And so people would show up on our doorstep on a Friday night, and they'd say, "Hey, is this where the Catholic prayer thing is?" And we're like, "Yeah, sure, come on in." And I would get a guitar out, and I would sing some praise and worship, and people loved it. And so through that, through a lot of effort, then we really did start building community. But it took some time, and that's one of the challenges in the Catholic Church today is that. The young adults who stick it out are few and far between. This is something I've addressed this topic a little bit, especially on the romantic side, about why you should pursue a spouse and don't just date casually. And something I see in the comments all the time is people who are like, I don't know where any other young adults are. I would love to find a Catholic man or a Catholic woman, but I can't find any. And the fact that the church just seems so indifferent to this need. We're failing other demographics as well, but we're really failing young adults in this respect, and it's a tragic thing. With that said, at my Latin Mass, that's not the case.
No, it's not, and that's why I want to bring up two things. It's a double-edged sword, because I have a love-hate even with the idea of young adult, because I'm 35 and I know the diocese has young adult and it goes to 35, and I'm like, I got gray in my beard. I got soon to be 6 kids. I got a mortgage. I'm not a young adult. I'm a tired adult. But I get
fully
it. Fully
initiated.
Yes, I've been I've been adulting for a decade and a half now. Um,
Yeah.
I get it though. I get it. So on the one hand, it's good to sort of go to the young adult direction because they need it. On the other hand, a lot of people, I think, almost look at being a young adult as like a new type of being an adolescent. It's like, well, I'm a young adult, so like, what do young adults do? It's like, well, they're just adults who are either married or not married, so they do what married or non-married
Right.
people do. Anyway, but I know exactly
Yeah.
what you're saying. Um, so we lucked out when we reverted because I was Catholic, and then there was a big conversion. That's a whole other story, but that would take 2 hours to lay out anyway. But when we reverted, she was baptized Catholic as well. We actually went to elementary school together, so we didn't have to like come into the church, but we had to learn the faith and we had to live in a state of grace and all these kinds of things. And so that was where we had to do the work. But we moved when I got a job teaching at a Catholic high school, and luckily fell into a pretty strong conservative Catholic community. And that was why it was so easy, I think, to make friends. It wasn't from work. Most of the people at work didn't like me because I was too orthodox, mainly. And it was also during the time of the rise of Donald Trump, and I was not into politics at the time. I had rejected politics because I was such a liberal. Like, I wasn't a leftist, but I was such a liberal as a secular university student. So when I came back to the church, I realized just how much of an idiot I was. So I was like, I'm just going to leave me alone, politics. I don't want to talk about you, and I'll just learn the faith. And then the Trump thing was like the apocalypse for people, that everyone was talking about it. And I just, being the contrarian, I guess, that I am, I'm like, wait, isn't he say he's pro-life? Like, shouldn't we support him? And it was like, how dare you, you crazy, crazy weirdo. So I didn't make a lot of friends at work. But we did fall into these good friendships, and they were great. Then, and maybe you can have a similar transition, maybe you can tell me about this, we found tradition. And we found Catholic tradition hard, We did go to a diocesan TLM community for about a year and a half. Where we live, though, it's like an hour and a half drive. It's just not sustainable. So we did that. But, like, my wife started dressing with just the skirts, and we started finding modesty, and we're not praying the luminous mysteries anymore, and like things. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying we adopted tradition, a different calendar, different mass, that kind of stuff. And then we actually lost friends, especially when we went to the SSPX.
Yeah.
I get that. But we lost friends, and we gained new friends, but it was like a second conversion. We there was a tension now. We didn't do it. Like, we didn't try to do it. We tried to be involved with all the conservative Catholic stuff, but there was just almost like this we got the impression that people thought that we were like leaving the club, and that we didn't think that they were good anymore, something like that. And maybe it was my fault. I don't know. But I'm just saying that was the thing. Did you find something when you went from like kind of conservative Novus Ordo to tradition? Was that also a difficult transition?
Yeah. So I'll say, first of all, that I wouldn't say that we had a terribly orthodox Novus Ordo parish. We had the parish that was close by, and there were intentionally orthodox Catholics that we were friends with who went, insofar as we had experienced, like, relatively orthodox, relatively speaking. We were all people who were trying to live the Catholic faith faithfully. But like a lot was going on. We got a new a new pastor at one point, and with the rotation for priests, you have the potential of a particular pastor being at your parish for 8 or 9 years. And this guy was bad news. He immediately, his first homily, the first thing he did was introduce himself as, I consider myself something of a cross between a Jesuit and a Franciscan. And I'm like, okay, but you're not. You're a diocesan priest. So why
What
are
does that
you
even mean?
pretending?
Yeah.
Even, yeah. What does that mean? He was wearing blue jeans and like not even like endearing sandals, but like Velcro sandals under his vestments. And we stayed behind quite late after mass to greet him and introduce ourselves as our new pastor. And he was speaking quite loudly to the next person in line in front of us to greet him, about how the people at his old parish were just a bunch of stupid rednecks, and he was so glad to be out of there. And I was like,
That's
that's
not
how
good.
you talk to spiritual children? Yeah, like very, very alarming.
Those are my
He
people
went on
rednecks.
to do yeah, yeah. He went on to do things like the sanctuary of anything decorative or ornate that he could, like a very stark minimalist sort of liturgical instinct. The homilies were at best just, I don't know, very, very hard to follow and nonsensical if you were giving them the benefit of the doubt. At worst, explicitly heretical at times.
Wow.
And I just remember thinking, um, yeah, but so my oldest daughter, she'll be an adult by the time this guy gets moved potentially, and we cannot suffer this. I can't tolerate this. Simultaneously, I had also been just really struggling with, like I'm very sensitive to aesthetics. Like I'm a graphic designer by trade. I've always been artistic. I've always been very moved by music and very intentional about the kind of music that I listen to. And so the aesthetics at our parish had been bothering me for quite a long time, and not just because of the banality of modern Catholicism, but because there wasn't even any apparent effort being put into the liturgy, right? Like it was just complacency, and that really bothered me. And so I found myself going to mass and then coming away from mass where I used to feel refreshed and fulfilled, and and drawn into the life of the spirit. I was now finding myself just angry and
Hmm.
resentful,
Yeah.
and mad at myself for that, because I was like, I shouldn't feel this way. This is my fault, and really giving myself a hard time over it.
Hmm.
And then there was one week where, after this weird homily, we go up to receive the Eucharist, and this isn't something I had explored explicitly, but I felt prompted to kneel and to receive communion on the tongue. I had never done that before, and I hadn't read about it. I wasn't convicted about it
Just your Catholic
necessarily.
sense. It's your Catholic
I just
sense.
felt, yeah, or maybe just a prompting of the Holy Spirit. And I found myself saying, no, I'm not doing that. So I'm walking along in my pew, and then eventually out in the nave of the church. And the whole time I'm like having this argument with God. I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to draw attention to myself. Until eventually I'm like, okay, it's not going away, so I'm just going to try and see what happens. And so I get up there, and the extraordinary minister of Holy Communion doesn't know what I'm doing. And so she pats me on the head, and I was like, oh, no, I'm trying to receive communion. And so she goes, oh, and she takes the host, and she really abruptly just kind of shoves it in my mouth. And I,
That's
here I
weird.
am
Yeah, that's not a
wanting
good
to do
time.
something. No, yeah, I wanted to do something more reverent, and it ends up being this kind of catastrophic, like very irreverent reception. And I'm sure people saw that. So I go back to my pew, just really discouraged and embarrassed, and
Yeah.
kind of heartbroken. Simultaneously, the band is playing a saxophone solo, like literally a saxophone solo is going on while I'm kneeling down trying to. I'm like, am I at a
Kenny G.
like? Yeah, is this a Kenny G concert? Where am I right now? Like, this is, I can't pray, I can't focus. And my prayer at that moment was, God, forgive me because I'm being so judgmental right now. But like, where are you? I'm just struggling to find you. And I don't tend to have very audible or even in my mind's eye visual like responses from God. Like, I'm not a very charismatic Christian, but I very strongly got the sense that he was saying, I'm not here. And I have to qualify that by saying that, yes, the
I know.
Eucharist is
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
valid and everything. But, if you're looking through a pane of glass and it's covered in dirt, in mud and saxophone solos, and people in, wearing clothing that is just not fit for a wedding banquet, which is what, we're supposed to be doing when we encounter the Lord, or the sacrifice of Calvary, depending on how you want to think of it. Um, just this completely casual, noisy, distracting atmosphere. And I just remember thinking, like, and I literally started tearing up when I thought that he was saying that to me. You're not here? How can that be? Like, what am I supposed to do with that? That's heartbreaking. And I was just so bothered by that experience. So all of that accumulated to the point where I was like, we need to change. I can't go on. Like, I'm going to lose my faith if we continue to push on. Simultaneously, also seeing, families that when we first started attending that church, which is our only experience of Catholicism. I didn't grow up in the church, so I hadn't been able to observe this for any length of time. But by this point, I had been in the Catholic Church long enough to observe what appeared to be intentionally faithful families who were there with little kids when I first started attending, who were now teenagers, who were absent, who had left the church, right? And I'm thinking, okay, my kids are coming up to that age. Do I have confidence that they're going to retain the faith? No, not at all, based on what I'm seeing. Like, I hate this atmosphere. I can't pray in it. It's culturally just offensive, and it's the general attitude is just an atmosphere of complacency. So simultaneously, we knew some friends that were going to a Latin Mass, and we're like, okay, why don't we try that? I mean, that's going to be a big change. So that's what initially led us there. So that was my very, very long way of answering your question. Yes, we had friends in sort of that Novus Ordo environment who were clearly angry with us and hostile towards that, and we did lose. I think some friends. When my wife started wearing skirts as well, she would get these snarky remarks from friends about like implying that her husband was making her do this kind of thing, that she was now oppressed and stuff.
Yeah.
And, the irony is that like traditional people in any flavor of life, whether it's Catholicism or otherwise, get branded as the stereotype is these are the judgmental people, right?
I know.
I've never like I've gone into Mass and thought, that's an inappropriate thing to wear to Mass, but you would never see me walk up to that person and be like, what are you doing? Like, how dare you? Or even just to do it subtly, like, oh, it's you must be a little cold today.
You're going to the beach today or
right?
something.
Like,
yeah.
Exactly. I would never dream of doing that, right? And here are the supposedly more tolerant and liberal Catholics who are approaching my wife and doing this very thing that they would condemn if they got a glimpse of it in traditional circles.
Well,
so yeah, a lot of hostility and a lot of rupture took place there.
Well, let's just say, even if somebody did walk up to somebody who was dressed inappropriately for Mass and told them, you could still do, like, that would still be okay to do. I've never done it. I haven't seen it done. But I'm just saying, if one were to be like, in a nice way, obviously there's personalities and manners, but like, hey, are you new here? That's wonderful. It's great. We don't wear tank tops, like we don't wear mini skirts. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with that because this used to be so normal in society. Like, I mean, again, we're a similar age. And when I was a kid, and I'm sure when you were a kid, like the neighbor would like see you doing something bad on your lawn and be like, hey, cut it out, young man. Your mom wouldn't like that. Like that was okay because it was like, you shouldn't swear, And it's like, well, I probably shouldn't swear because like the moral code that's being enforced by the good neighbors that I have are telling me not to, I'm going to listen to that. So they wouldn't even be bad, but you're right. It doesn't even happen. It doesn't, and,
No.
Okay, so that's really fascinating, though, when you talk about the major moment is basically realizing with your daughter, she's going to be an adult by the time this priest leaves. So we didn't have a good parish, so to speak, but we had this catechism family group of like the neighboring parishes. So it was like once a month. We didn't really have much parish life, but it was like this intra-parish life. It was
Yep.
So we had that, but we didn't see most of those people when we went to Mass on Sunday. Maybe if there was like 20 families, there was like 2 at our parish and then 10 over there and 6 over there, whatever. And so we didn't have a terrible parish. It wasn't like – that was actually kind of a crisis of conscience for me when I discovered – so, not to make this about the SSPX, but just in the perspective of – when I discovered the SSPX, it was 20 minutes from my house, whereas the Latin Mass was an hour, and in bad weather and the snow, it's an hour and a half, and it's dangerous, and it's 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and whatever. My diocese is kind of a wasteland for tradition. And when I was kind of having this crisis of conscience, because I'm like, okay, I'm okay with going to the traditional chapel if there is a state of necessity. I kind of understood what that meant. I was okay with the logic of it. But then I remember asking myself, I'm like, well, my parish isn't that bad. Like, no, it's not. Like now I would say it would be really bad, but it wasn't like clown mass. It wasn't, the priests were fine. Yeah. I mean, it was chicken soup for the soul most of the time, but it wasn't heresy. The choir was a decent folk choir. Like they were in tune and they played the guitars well. The church itself was very beautiful. It was an old church that had been renovated. The high altar was gone, but like the frescoes were still there and stuff. Like it was, you walked in and you were like, this is a pleasant Catholic place to be. But just like you, I remember thinking to myself, okay, I mean, my oldest is only 8, and we've got our 6th child will be here in 2 months. So things were happening really kind of fast and furious. And this is like 4 years ago or so. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm teaching these kids in the Catholic school, and none of them go to church. And none of my colleagues' kids go to church, the odd one. And I'm like, the ones that do, because I had discovered tradition, really the ones that were continuing the faith, for the most part, they were either basically living as traditionalists without going to traditional mass. You know, like they had all the artwork and the rosaries and all that stuff in their house. It was like they basically were traditionalists. I'm like, there's something there. Yeah. Or they basically had turned their Catholic family faith experience into a very Protestant type of experience, meaning it was all activities. It was like, you know, they definitely had a sense of Christian community, but it was like we go to the prayer meetings, we go to the praise and worship thing, we go to the summer camp, we go to the Bible study, I go to do net ministries, I go into, and those things, they had their goods to them, but I'm like, is it the Catholicism keeping them there? Or is it the life? Because a lot of those things my kids might not take to. You know, maybe my kids don't want to be a camp counselor with the, you know, like there's just things where this isn't, I was like, there has to be a way for my kids to just be Catholic and just learn their catechism, read books, go to sacraments, and like they should keep their faith. It shouldn't be, and again, I'm not saying what these parents are doing is bad. They're doing the best they can, and what they've done is extremely positive because they've worked so hard to keep their kids in. But I'm like, all that's outside the parish. The parish should be keeping my kids in the church. That's why it's there. You know, all these nonprofits, they're great. But like, again, that's, you know, I saw the danger. I'm like, well, that's going to become about individuals. It's like, well, so-and-so is really good at like, he's got gifts and prays over people. And so-and-so is like, is really good at leading praise and worship. It's like, well, I'm glad so-and-so is a great musician. But then that has the danger of becoming sort of like a cult of personality. Does that make sense? Like that was a danger I really had to wrestle with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like, I mean, we had this intra-parish kind of community as well, in large part extending from that young adult community that we had started with the prayer group at our house. So it wasn't so much that we needed our parish to be the be all end all, but at the same time, you do need your parish to do something for your children, even if it's just sort of, if it's acceptable in its, I don't know, the measure of what a parish is supposed to be, you know, in terms of its liturgical life, its the catechesis that you might get from it, all of these kinds of things. But in our case, it was becoming less than acceptable, and I just didn't have the confidence anymore that that our kids would survive that. I knew for me it was a big turn off. And as I saw the kids from these other families turning 16, 17 and just disappearing from the life of the church, I found myself just thinking, how can I blame them? Like, if I was that age, why I wouldn't stick around if I had been raised this way? Because the reason I'm sticking around is because of grace, right? I know that I can't abandon my faith. I can't abandon the Eucharist, and I can't abandon the church because I need that grace to survive and to hopefully inherit eternal life. But if you're raised in that atmosphere, in the sacramental life, and, you know, a family that is hopefully a prayerful family, then grace will just seem like something you can take for granted. You don't know what it looks like on the other side, the way a convert does, right? Yeah. And so if I turn 16, 17, I'd be like, well, I don't need this crappy preaching on Sunday mornings that is completely irrelevant to me. I don't need to listen to this bad music and this ritual that I don't really understand. I can go off and be happy like the rest of my friends apparently are, not knowing that you're going to all of a sudden, you're going to lose that divine life that has sustained you throughout your life. And that was my fear for my kids, because they were being raised as Catholics like that, who could take grace for granted. And then moving over to Latin Mass, it really was about my kids. I mean, yes, I had my complaints, but as a bachelor, I could have just stuck.
You can tough a lot of stuff out if it's not for your kids. Yeah, you can tough a lot of things out. Yeah. But
to risk the souls of my children was just not a price I was willing to pay. And when we went over to the Latin Mass, my kids immediately they were drawn into it. They loved it. I gave them the option at one point. I've told this story a few times, and I said, "Okay, we've been going to this Latin Mass for a few weeks now. Do you want to go back to our old parish, or do you want to keep going to the Latin Mass?" And they were like, "Latin Mass, Latin Mass."
That's good.
We were in the van, and I could see all these hands in the rearview mirror, like triumphantly cheering and stuff. And I was like, "Okay, then, like this is obviously connecting with them." And it wasn't just the liturgy. I mean, liturgy is one thing. But it was like there was lots of other young kids there that they were identifying with, who looked like them, who dressed like them, who cared about the things that they cared about. And there was just a buzz in the room. There was a vitality in the atmosphere of that community. And it's tripled in size since we started attending. So there's that vitality has shown itself in profound ways.
There's a story that reminded me of, I forgot to say it last time I was talking, but I never had an experience at Mass where I was like, God's not here. But out of the mouths of babes, we had been going to the Latin. So we started going to the Latin Mass in 2018. And we didn't go exclusively. We were going most of the time. And then exclusively by the end of 2018. And then, ever since then, I think I've been to the Novus Ordo like a couple times for like a reason of charity, like a wedding or something like that, kind of whatever. But I haven't gone to the Novus Ordo for mass on a Sunday in like 4 years or something. But except for one time. So it was just before lockdown. It was 2020. And we had been roped into this marriage prep thing. And this was like 9 months before. Like these people that ran the marriage prep for the diocese for this particular cluster of parishes asked us, will you sponsor such and such couple in February? And this is like July when they're asking us. And we're like, sure, whatever. We just put it on the calendar. And we didn't even think it through. And we're like, oh, we're going to have to go there for Mass on Sunday like that. It was at like that. We had to be there at the 10 a.m. Mass. Not that, they don't call it a high Mass, but like the one with all the singing, whatever. And this is a very strong Catholic community in the sense of like this is out in the sticks in southwestern Ontario, a lot of farmers, a lot of Irish and Dutch, and they got 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 kids. Like these people do follow the teachings of the church for the most part. And we used to look up to this place. Like we would be like, we're going to go to that parish. It was still beautiful because they had kept everything but just took the altar rail out and inserted a table altar, but everything else was there. They also put TV screens up, which had a really nice contrast with the gold-leafed frescoes. Anyway, my goodness gracious. I'm not as artistic as you, but I think one of the reasons you and I are both fond of Dr. Kwasniewski is I was listening to his article or thing the other day, his podcast he did about like seeing through the eyes of tradition and how he's like in a place with bad music and like his head starts to hurt. I get that way too. I'm like, shut up, stop the stupid noise. But anyway, so we're in this parish, and my son at the time, my oldest son, he was 4. He wasn't 5 yet. And there's praise and worship going. My wife's wearing a veil because we just come from like going to Latin Mass for the last 2 years. And we're in there, and it's a disaster. Like the priest is like fist pumping guys on the way up, and like it was whatever. It was a whole thing. And my son's dancing. He's dancing because the praise and worship's going on. And he looks up at my wife, and he goes to my wife, is God in this church too, Mummy? Now, we don't know if he was excited about God being there because it was happy and fun, or we don't know if he didn't think God was. But either way, we said to ourselves, this is a crossroads we're at here because our son's 4, and we know this is a disaster, and we know it's not sustainable. So he's either really excited about the disaster, which is bad, or he knows it's a disaster, which is bad, but it's good that he knows that. So it was something similar to what you went through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, and this is another story I've told quite a few times now, but shortly after we started attending the Latin Mass, he was at the time 2 years old. He's older now, obviously, but so he was getting restless and making noise and stuff, and so I picked him up, and just as I did, there was this like plume of incense floating over us, and it caught the rays of the stained glass windows, and he immediately just started going, prayers, and it reminded, well, I won't say it reminded me, it it instilled in me the understanding that this more sensory approach, this more sacramental, this more embodied kind of spirituality, which is what Catholicism is supposed to be, what an incarnational spirituality is, right? Is something that even a 2-year-old will just immediately understand. He'll be drawn to the mysticism of it. He'll be drawn to how profound it is. Whereas at a Novus Ordo, it's, he might be dancing in the pew, but he's not going to associate that with God in the same way that he doesn't associate dancing in front of the stereo at home, which my little kids will do, with prayer or anything like that. This is party time. This is a fun thing to do, right? This isn't a prayer thing to do. And we do need to have those distinctions between the profane life and the sacred life. And profane here, it's important to point out for people that profane not meaning vulgar, but just the ordinary, right? That's sort of the way that the church has used that word in the tradition. Whereas those distinctions are just utterly blurred in most other Novus Ordo parishes, to the degree that the profane is actually encroaching upon the sacred, and the sacred is often just not even present in many respects. So the more I had those kinds of experiences, the more I was confirmed in this confidence that the Latin Mass is going to give my kids the best chance of retaining this faith that I was trying to transmit to them.
Two things. One, I know some people are going to watch this and think, well, what about I have a really good Novus Ordo? It's like really traditional. With respect, I don't even know if there is one of those in all of Canada. Like maybe the Oratorians do it in Toronto. What I mean by that is the so-called unicorn. So people will bring this up, and I'm like, listen, that reality doesn't exist for me. I'd have to drive to like Chicago or something. I don't even know where it is. And then even there, I mean, once you really start to dive into the liturgy, and you've talked about this with the Lex Orandi, Lex Credendi, yes, there can be a very aesthetically pleasing Novus Ordo for sure. Of course they can do that. I mean, there's people, and God bless them for it. I mean, that's obviously objectively better than an aesthetically displeasing Novus Ordo. Of course it is. It's going to inspire deeper Catholic devotion, and if that's what you go to and that inspires devotion, I'm happy for you. But when you read the Missal and things, the theology is still going to be the thing that at least is very encouraging of or permissive of what is, generally speaking, seen in the Novus Ordo. And there's an issue there. It's like that's the exception that proves the rule. So that's something that, what was I going to say here? I lost my train of thought. Anyway, I was going to think it was something. What did you say before that? It was really important, I thought. Maybe it wasn't.
About my son's experience, I think that sensory experience.
The sensory. I don't know. Anyway, but that's the children having the sensory experiences. Oh, this is what I wanted to say. Here it is. The reductionist. We've become so beaten down in the church as far as liturgy is concerned that people, like you're saying, well, there was a level that I thought was acceptable, but it wasn't even acceptable. And that's the mentality people have. I remember I was at a men's conference years ago, and this speaker, former professional football player, Elvis Gerbach, a Pro Bowl football player, had a big conversion, was doing the men's conference circuit and whatever, getting men all riled up. It was fun. But I remember he was talking about how he got his kids to stay in, and he was like just telling us an anecdote. He's like, I say to Jimmy, whatever his name is, the music's bad. Okay, the preaching's bad, and I know it can be boring. And he's like, but Jesus is really there. And I remember at that time being like, are we accepting the fact that the thing that's supposed to be the intersection between heaven and earth is just not good? And so it's not necessarily like we're not both praising tradition here because from the mindset that the Novus Ordo experience is negative. What we're saying is that it's just not positive. Like it's the opposite. It's like it's like heaven and hell. Yes, I am scared of hell, like in the sense of I don't want to go there. But I'm more enamored with the idea of going to heaven than I am being scared of hell, and that's what we should be. There's an analogy there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that lowest common denominator too, because I find that, like, again, this is the attitude of complacency. It's like, it's not great, but it's valid. It's like, that's we're content with that, really? Like, and these aren't even things that we can't fix. We could totally fix these things, right? There was that Pew survey that came out recently, ranking music and preaching, I think, in various churches, and the Catholic Church. It was just based on surveys of people who go to church and what their level of satisfaction was with the preaching and the music, and the Catholic Church came out at the bottom, which is to say, I mean, yes, we can complain about that, but it's to say that there is better preaching and there is better music out there. These are things that we could be much more deliberate about. We could do a better job of this. We don't have to say, yeah, it's too bad, but Jesus is there, so it's fine. It's like, I mean, this is not, it's not acceptable. It's not a virtue to just tolerate mediocrity. We should be wanting to excel in this aspect of life. Look at all the other areas of life where we do expect excellence from ourselves, in our jobs, in the sports that we play, and all of these kinds of things. We take those so seriously. We don't tolerate mediocrity there. So why, when it comes to the most important thing you do every week, and I'm not just talking about the lay people, but the people who are actually in charge of organizing this, the priests and the people on liturgy committees and such, it's like, why are we so content with something that is such a turnoff to the vast majority of people? It's inexcusable, and it's harming souls.
It's harming souls. It's harming souls. And I always go back to the first book of the Bible, Cain and Abel, and when the story of Cain and Abel is extremely important for a billion different reasons. And there is a priest named Father Maudsley who did write a book about the conversion of the Jews, prophesied with Cain and Abel, Cain being the older brother who kills the younger brother who is pleasing to God. This is the Sanhedrin, ordering the murder of Christ and things like that. There's lots of typology there. But there's also a very liturgical typology. Listen, there was no sacrament before the holy sacrifice of the Mass. I get that. Like, there was no Holy Eucharist. But there was, according to the Old Testament, liturgy, prayer, worship that was pleasing to God and it wasn't pleasing to God. And what we find with Cain and Abel, and this is obviously and it can be and I should also qualify this, one can offer something that is aesthetically pleasing while having a hard heart, and then that's just going to be that person's judged on their individual. But that doesn't mean the aesthetics are bad. So people will say, well, what if the traditionalist is a bad guy? And it's like, well, he's a bad guy, but the liturgy is still objectively good, so that's not really an argument. So with Cain and Abel, though, they both offer God what is, technically speaking, a valid sacrifice. And both of their sacrifices do prefigure the Eucharist, because Cain offers a lamb, or Abel offers a lamb, and Cain offers grain. Well, we have ultimately, and then Abel is killed by his older brother, so we see the victim and we see the lamb offered as bread. Those are all the three things there. But what we find with Cain's sacrifice, it's not accepted by God. It's not because it's not a real sacrifice. It's not accepted because of how he offers the thing. Okay? So when we say things like, well, don't worry, it's valid, it's like, well, hold on a second here. The intention behind which we offer the thing, I'm not talking about the intention to confect the sacrament, that's a different thing. But the intention with which we offer the ceremony, the liturgy, those things are not accidentals. They're not things that are extras. It's like a diamond ring. You buy your wife an engagement ring. Any jeweler worth his salt, unless you specifically desire like just a gold band with like a little diamond in it, they'll never really do that. Every diamond ring is going to have a setting, because everything around it actually makes the diamond sparkle more and makes you see it more, and it makes it more beautiful. And you can add too much and you can be too reductionist. So really, a jeweler, to continue with the analogy, who's an incredible jeweler, if he's had a long career, his skills will have developed. He'll reach a point where he makes the most beautiful ring possible, and you don't want to make it any worse, and it can't be any better. And that's basically what the Latin Mass is like. We have the pearl of great price in this, and everything that's around it. We not only do we know it's valid, we feel it's valid. We breathe it's valid. We hear it's valid. We see it's valid. We consume its validity. And none of those things have to be explained to you when you go to the TLM. Anyway, that's kind of my soapbox thing. But when people will say, it's valid, it's like we got to be careful with that. And one last thing I'll say is when people say, well, what do you expect? We're just going to, fix all the liturgies. And it's like, yes, I do expect that, because look what we did during COVID. With respect, look at all the energy in the world. Every parish has to have stickers and ropes and masks and new videos recorded about how to do this. That's like, literally, if the Pope did tomorrow and said, you have 6 months, maybe they can't all say Latin Mass. You have 6 months to fix your altars, turn yourself around, develop some postures, and say an old missal translated into vernacular. I guarantee they could do it.
Yeah. Well, and simultaneously, there's a few analogies in this. One is that people will really resent any sort of criticism that's directed towards the Novus Ordo. They'll say, they're both valid, they're both Jesus, they're both the Mass. It's wrong to criticize either of them. It's like, well, hang on here. Why did we pursue a reform of the liturgy in the first place if it wasn't based on some criticism of the Mass that had already existed? We recognized that there was something here that needed to change because it was deficient in some way, or maybe excessive in some way, but it needed to be calibrated. And so the church went through this whole process of reforming things. And if you want to tell me that it can't be done, well, that's exactly what they did do. They completely, they rewrote the Mass. They didn't come up with new standards for sanctuaries and architecture and art, but somehow that conspiracy persisted everywhere with the exact same flavor. I don't know how that happened exactly, but it's obviously possible. And it doesn't. And if you're in favor of those reforms, or just reform in general, then why not a further reform? Why not recognize some of the concerns that a lot of people have, related to just some of the explicit complaints that we have, but also the witness of the countless people who are walking away at vulnerable ages because they don't know that this is such a precious thing, because we haven't communicated that to them by the way that we worship and by the way that we package this whole thing. This comes back to branding again. No one's going to buy a product from a company with a cheesy Comic Sans PowerPoint clip art logo, right? They're going to look at that and be like, well, this isn't professional. These guys, it's probably a terrible product that these guys are offering, right? No one's going to be inspired to think that this is where the God of the universe resides, in this temple where we've got silly felt banners and juvenile music, and we're all acting like this is just another day in the life of profanity, of just like I would when I go to Walmart and I check out. We're not communicating that, and we have to be.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Comic Sans. I'm not a graphic designer, so I make my thumbnails using Canva. But sometimes I look at even some of the canned templates and stuff on Canva. I'm like, this is better than what they're using for the synod right now. Like, I'm using a service that costs me $10 a month. You know what I mean? And it's like,
yeah.
Anyway, it's just whatever. Okay, last we got about 8 minutes. We're gonna go an hour and a half here. Let's do a little tiny thought experiment, and then we'll end off with. If you were Pope, they'd call you Pope Brian the Red. Pope Brian the Red. If you were Pope, 4 things you would do immediately. What would they be?
This is something I could have answered 10 years ago with some confidence, but so much has gone on and so much is under the bridge. So much water is under the bridge now that I don't even know where to start. I'm pretty sure I would fire everybody in the Curia, and not because I think everybody there is necessarily corrupt or evil or whatever, but you can't be confident. Like, there's enough bad apples there, and the people who aren't will land on their feet. They'll have other jobs somewhere that they can possibly do, but I would definitely completely clean house there. I have concerns with the College of Cardinals at this point as well, but if they elected me, maybe they're not so bad. But there's definitely concerns there. Something to do with Germany. I mean, there's got to be a response. I don't know what exactly it would be, but you can't you can't just continue to tolerate what's going on there. We need to be willing to excommunicate people again, especially public people. So whether we're talking bishops,
excommunicate trads, Brian. Come on.
Well, exactly. But if it's some of those bishops, I mean, if they're out there explicitly contradicting Catholic teaching, it's like, okay, it's just formality at this point. You are excommunicated. I'm not even like excommunicating you. You are excommunicated, and everybody should know that, right? Politicians, same kind of thing. Those who identify their Catholicism with the creed that they propose and that they promote to the world, if it's actually contrary to the Catholic faith, they should be excommunicated. They should not be allowed to scandalize people in that way and sow division and confusion. I think this would be hard for me, but maybe the last thing I would say is I would shut up as the Pope. I would stop speaking and publishing and writing as much as the popes do. That's a very modern phenomenon that I don't think people really realize, that the number of encyclicals that they get written today. It's like, how many more times do we have to do another social teaching encyclical? It's like, most people don't understand what's already been written. Let's devote attention to understanding what has been written and what has been said. We don't need to say more. There's just way too much that has been said and written. We don't need to layer that further and further. First things have to be first things. We have to prioritize those things first: the creed, the sacraments, the life of discipleship, what it means to know and love God. Those are the key things. And then you build upon those things, and secondary things have to be secondary. But because there's so much secondary and tertiary stuff that's out there, so people think that that's the faith. And it's like, no, that's not. That will help you understand it more deeply and more explicitly. But if you don't understand the fundamentals, you're going to be really confused. So let's stop giving interviews to people who are hostile towards us. Let's stop writing 80 paragraph encyclicals that have a lot of things that just don't need to be said, that can be misinterpreted or what have you. Let's get back to clarity and to promoting the true faith. I would certainly want to initiate some liturgical reform, but I don't know what the best strategy is in that.
So that's interesting, all the things you just said, because I've thought about this question a lot. Actually, as an author, every author will tell you they have 7 or 8 books in their head that they want to write right now, but they just can't. I have a book in my head that I've had to think about this from a fiction perspective. So I've thought about it for like hours, but I've never written it down yet. Maybe one day. But I never thought. The funny thing, my mind does not go to the things that you've mentioned, like the politics, the excommunications and stuff. The first thing I think about is stopping the bleeding. So the confessionals are a disaster because the priests are not trained in moral theology. The masses are a disaster for all the reasons we've illuminated. So my first thing, if I could think of like, this is my first 6 months, I would put a complete interdict worldwide on the reception of Holy Communion unless you were at a traditional parish. I know that would be exclusivist, but it's just like, I have moral certainty that anyone who's going to a traditional parish is going to be in that setting that's good. And I have moral certainty that the regular parishes are a disaster. And that would last a month. And then an interdict would also be put on preaching unless you're at a traditional parish. And then within very short order, and again, we showed this with COVID, a communique would be sent out by my Rottweiler, my CDF head or whatever. I'd call it the Holy Office again of the Inquisition. But it would be like, this is your 12-week sermon series where you're going to explain in layman's terms the Catechism of St. Pope Pius X or something like that. Like, you have to read this from the pulpit for 20 minutes or 30 minutes. Like, it would be something like that. And then, immediately all priests must turn around. You just have to turn around. You're just going to say your Novus Ordo using only the prayers that are the Catholic ones, and you're going to turn around and face the crucifix with the people, blah, blah, blah. Everyone can do that. Every altar in the world can do that. Little things like that. Yeah. And then with the confessionals are open, But the priests, unless they went to a traditional seminary, are forbidden to give advice. I know this sounds harsh, but when the people when the people will confess certain sins, they will have literature that they can give them to read on combating that sin. And because again, with email and stuff, it's so easy. It's like, these are sins, commandments 1 through 10. Pile number 1 is for, just tell them which piles to grab from, right? And it's like, that's going to be better than anything you could tell them with your chicken soup for the soul theology, which is just going to make them worse, And then within, 6 months to a year, there'll be a translation of the traditional Latin Mass into whatever vernacular is dominant with really good language as best as possible. And then within, let's say, 2 years, everyone is required to say the traditional Mass, unless they're Eastern, of course, that's different, but just required to say the traditional Mass in Latin, unless they're over, like, learning language is difficult, with the TLM when they got rid of it. I think it was over 75 were allowed to keep it, but they didn't have to learn a new language. It would be really hard for somebody over the age of like 55 to be expected. I understand. I used to teach languages. It's very tough for people when they're older to learn. So let's just say the number's 55. Yeah. Okay, fine. You can if you want, but you're grandfathered. But you still have to do literally just like if you open up your missal and it's like the translated side, you have to do that as the thing. Those are the things that I would do, and then I'd probably be assassinated.
Well, that's just it. I mean, you can identify certain ends that you want to achieve, but knowing myself and how difficult it is to move myself towards certain ends I want to achieve, I know that we are stubborn. We're stubborn creatures, right? Virtue only develops slowly, and you can't really legislate it, including the virtue of religion and faith for that matter. So I think that you do have to admit that there are limitations. If you've got word as the Pope that that the end is nigh, then maybe you have to accelerate that program. But I think that we would have to try to find measures to lead people along, because that's the nature of conversion. Conversion doesn't happen. Sometimes we get these dramatic conversion experiences, right? But for a lot of people, it's a lifetime affair where we have to try to lead them where we want to go, and that happens slowly and subtly. But when you say that, when you talk about the lack of formation in moral theology, that reminds me that when there have been major reform initiatives in the church, I think like Trent, for example. So Trent focused a lot of attention on the seminaries. Immediately after, that's the place to reform formation of seminarians, so that in a generation we'll have priests that actually can do what needs to be done and do it well. When we think about that age of revolution, right? So like the 18th and 19th centuries, again, that sort of renewal of neo-Thomism was sort of like, you need to be teaching Thomas in the seminaries, because the kinds of challenges that we are facing intellectually with the Enlightenment, Thomas is the antidote. And so I think that, of the things I said, that's got to be a much higher priority, is reform in the seminaries, certainly.
Yeah, I haven't announced it yet. I've told people I'm writing a book, but I did just sign with Sophia, and writing a book on modernism, and it'll be out like maybe by the end of next year, because it takes 12 to 15 months from start to finish with the process to get it on the shelf, sort of thing. But I'm done probably about 50, 60 pages of it, and I've been going through Kant and Hegel and Hume and Descartes, Tyrrell and Loisy, like basically the philosophical progenitors of modernism, and then the theological. And the greatest enemy of the church is not Freemasonry. The greatest enemy of the church is not, Islam. The greatest enemy is Immanuel Kant. The greatest enemy is René Descartes. The greatest enemy is Hegel, because that manner of thinking makes all of those heresies possible. Because it's a subjectivist, whatever. It's a materialist problem. It's a bifurcation of the cosmos and the universe, and the only, like I just finished narrating Augustine's Confessions for TAN, so Anthony Esselin's recent translation. I love Augustine.
Nice.
I took Augustine. Yeah, it's good. It's a really good one. I took Augustine's name as like my religious name when I entered the Third Order. Like, he's a really big deal to me. But Thomas has to be. It has to be Thomistic realism, because it's everything Augustine and Aristotle and Plato offered, but it's perfectly concentrated and distilled and distinctly Western, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen.
Well said.
We didn't even get to Chesterton. We didn't get to which beard products we like to use. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, you can buy Kennedy Report beard oil products in the link to the description, or the description box of the video. Lots more. One day you got to come back on my show if you're able to find time, because this has been wonderful.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as always, let me know what you think in the comment section to the video. Also, we will be running another men's conference in February, weekend of 17th, 18th, 19th, can't remember, so mark your calendars. Not ladies, but just gentlemen. If you're from Canada or the States, we did have some Americans last year. It's going to be about 220 people this year or so it'll be bigger. So stay tuned for that, and that's all. All right, Brian. We'll talk to you soon, and everyone let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.